The first question, the main site of gas exchange in human respiratory system, that is alveoli. Then during normal inspiration, which of the following occurs? Diaphragm contracts and flattens. Then the approximate tidal volume is 500 ml, and this is the volume that inspired or expired during normal breathing. Which muscle is primarily responsible for normal inspiration? The main muscle is diaphragm muscles. It is called as what? Phrenic muscles. And then external intercostal muscles are also there. External intercostal muscles. So these are the muscles which are involved in what? Inspiration process. Which of the following represents the correct direction of oxygen diffusion during normal inspiration? That is from alveoli to blood. Oxygen carrying pigment in human blood is what? Hemoglobin. Approximate what percentage of oxygen is transported by hemoglobin in human blood? That is about 97%. Which form accounts for the largest proportion of carbon dioxide transport in blood? Answer is bicarbonate ion, that is HCO3 minus. And this is with the help of what? Bicarbonate ion. This is with the help of RBC. And the percentage is about what? 70%. And 20 to 25% as carbaminohemoglobin, that is 23% with the help of hemoglobin, and then 7% with the help of plasma. Which enzyme facilitates the conversion of carbon dioxide and water into carbonic acid inside RBC? That is carbonic anhydrase. Carbon dioxide and water into carbonic acid, and then this carbonic acid dissociate into H plus and HCO3 minus, that is bicarbonate ion. The respiratory center responsible for basic rhythm, that is medulla oblongata. Normal expiration during quiet breathing is mainly what? Expiration is always passive because it occurs by relaxation of the muscles, while inspiration occurs by the contraction. So inspiration is what? Active process. Okay. So here the question is normal expiration. So the answer is what? Passive. The approximate vital capacity of healthy human adult is, it is about 3500 ml. The actual value is about 3500 to 4600, but according to NCRT, the answer is 3500 ml. Okay. So what is VC? This is IRV plus TV plus ERV. Residual volume refers to the volume of air remain in lungs after what? Forceful expiration. Volume of air remain in lungs after normal expiration is actually what? Functional residual volume. Normal expiration, the answer is functional residual volume. But here what? Forceful expiration. So the answer is residual volume. Okay. Which lung volume cannot be measured directly using a simple spirometer? That is what? Residual volume. Because the spirometer measures volumes of air that can be inhaled or exhaled. Since this residual volume cannot be exhaled, it cannot be measured. Okay. The exchange of gases across respiratory membrane occurs mainly by simple diffusion process. And then the respiratory membrane, the gases need to cross, that is alveolar epithelium, then the capillary endothelium, then the basement membrane between these two. Which of the following has the highest partial pressure of oxygen? Alveolar air. That is why the oxygen diffuse from where? From alveoli. This is the alveoli, and then the blood capillaries. So the oxygen will diffuse from alveoli to blood. This is the blood. Okay. This diffusion occurs since the partial pressure of oxygen is more in alveoli. Which factor favors the release of oxygen from hemoglobin in actively respiring tissues? That is high concentration of oxygen. That is the answer. Then other factors are also there. High carbon dioxide concentration, high temperature, then high acidity, and then what? Low partial pressure of oxygen. So these are the factors that favors the dissociation of what? Oxyhemoglobin. Okay, that is the release of oxygen from hemoglobin in tissues. And this increased carbon dioxide lowers pH, or that is the increased acidity, and decreases hemoglobin's affinity for oxygen, releasing the oxygen unloading. And this is actually the Bohr effect. Oxygen dissociation curve of hemoglobin is sigmoid, that is S-shaped. Which of the following conditions favors oxygen unloading from hemoglobin? The answer is what? Increased carbon dioxide concentration. This thing we discussed. Which structure prevents food from entering the trachea during swallowing? The answer is epiglottis. So suppose if this is the nose, and below nose what is present? Mouth is present, right? And then this part is actually called as what? Pharynx. Okay. So this is the part where air, and this is the part where what is present? Food is present. And then pharynx, it is the common passage for both food and air. Then after pharynx, it divides into two tubes, one tube at front and one tube at back. This is the trachea or windpipe, and this is the esophagus. Okay. And when we swallow food, what happens? There is a chance of entering into the trachea. But here, the opening of this trachea is covered by a cartilaginous flap, and this is called as what? Epiglottis. Okay. So the answer is, that is, the structure prevents food from entering the trachea during swallowing. That is the epiglottis. Which of the following is correctly matched? Tidal volume, that is 500 ml, it is correct. And then residual volume, it is not 500 ml, that is what, 1100 to 1200. And the vital capacity, this thing we discussed, it is about 3500. And inspiratory reserve volume, that is actually 2500 to 3000 ml. Okay, so the answer is tidal volume 500 ml. The volume of air inspired or expired during normal quiet breathing, that is actually what? The tidal volume, which is about 500 ml. The total volume of air that can be accommodated in the lungs, it is called as total lung capacity, which is about 5800 to 6000 ml. That is vital capacity plus residual volume. That is the TLC, total lung capacity. Functional residual volume is equal to what? ERV plus RV. So option B is the answer. Next question, inspiratory capacity, that is IC equals what? TV plus ERV, right? So TV plus, sorry, not ERV, IRV, TV plus IRV. So the first option, that is TV plus IRV, that is the answer. Then vital capacity is represented by what? IRV plus TV plus ERV. Option B is the answer. Which respiratory volume remain in lungs even after forceful expiration? That is the residual volume. The respiratory membrane is extremely thin, primarily to facilitate what? Rapid diffusion of gases. The number of alveoli in human lungs, it is about 300 million. The right lung in human differs from left lung because the right lung, it has 3 lobes. Which cells are primarily responsible for transporting oxygen in blood? RBC, that is erythrocytes. When oxygen binds with hemoglobin in lungs, the compound formed is what? Oxyhemoglobin. That is Hb plus O2 gives what? HbO2, which is the oxyhemoglobin. Carbon dioxide binds with hemoglobin to form a product called carbaminohemoglobin. And next question, carbon monoxide is dangerous because it has very high affinity for hemoglobin. That is about 200 to 250 times more affinity than hemoglobin. Which condition shift the oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve to right? That is increased carbon dioxide. And this is indicating the Bohr effect or what? Unloading of oxygen. The Bohr effect refers to what? Reduced oxygen affinity because of higher carbon dioxide concentration. So this is the answer. Which condition favors oxygen loading onto hemoglobin? That is high partial pressure of oxygen. Then low partial pressure of carbon dioxide. Then low temperature and low acidity. These are the other factors that favors the formation of what? Oxyhemoglobin. Okay. Which of the following is not a function of respiratory system? Gas exchange is there. Regulation of blood pH is there. Then voice production is there because of larynx, the voice box. And then the digestion of proteins, it is the function of digestive system. So this is the answer. The larynx is commonly known as what? Voice box. The trachea is prevented from collapsing mainly due to C-shaped cartilaginous ring. 16 to 20 cartilaginous rings are there in trachea. So if this is the trachea, it is characterized by the presence of what? C-shaped or incomplete cartilaginous rings are there. Okay. And this is the structure which helps in what? Preventing collapsing. Which respiratory disorder is associated with destruction of alveolar wall? That is emphysema. Asthma primarily involves narrowing and inflammation of airways. Occupational respiratory disorders are commonly associated with prolonged exposure to dust particles. Which part of the respiratory tract is shared by both respiratory and digestive system? That is this thing we discussed, the pharynx. Which structure divides into right and left primary bronchi? That is the trachea. Which of the following is the correct sequence of airflow? That is from nostrils to pharynx, then pharynx to larynx, then to trachea, then bronchi, bronchioles and alveoli. The pressure of oxygen in alveoli is higher than what? Deoxygenated blood entering pulmonary capillaries. The respiratory rhythm is influenced strongly by changes in the concentration of what? Carbon dioxide and H+. Which statement about alveoli is correct? They have high rich blood supply and thin walls. Then the last question, which combination correctly represents the major respiratory volumes? So TV is 500 ml, that is correct. IRV is 2500 to 3000. ERV is 1000 to 1100. RV is 1100 to 1200. So this is the right answer.